It's time for a Centerboro Sports Report. I'm your host, Randy Sepew. Let's talk about athletic animals. You know, when we talk about the contributions that animals have made to the world of sports, too often those contributions are in the form of equipment. Horse hides, catgut, leather, pigskin. Sure, occasionally you'll see two ducks doing a bit of synchronized swimming, but in general, animals aren't known for their ability to, say, run marathons or make tricky penalty kicks. Walter R. Brooks didn't let that get in the way. Right from the start of the Freddy the Pig series, there were signs that at least some of the barnyard denizens weren't necessarily sloths. In Freddy Goes to Florida, our porcine hero and 10 friends set out for Florida on foot. It's quite a hike, more than 1,000 miles. In the second book, Freddy Goes to the North Pole, a somewhat different group hoofed more than 3,000 miles to visit Santa Claus at home. Once they got there, most went skiing, and Jinx hung out in the gymnasium. But in that same book, we were told not to expect our heroes to engage in most traditional team sports. In one scene, Freddy's reading the baseball news to a group of animals when he's repeatedly interrupted by Jinx and grows impatient and snaps, "What's the sense of getting all excited about a game played by somebody else? A game that we animals couldn't play ourselves if we wanted to." 15 years later, in Freddy and the Popinjay, Brooks had softened his stance a bit, but still made it reasonably clear that baseball, at least, wasn't really a good fit. Quote, "Although most of the animals could catch a ball, either with a glove or in their teeth, none of them could throw, and the only animal who could bat was Peter the bear, and he was so strong that when he really connected with the ball, he usually knocked the cover off, and then the game stopped until somebody went to Centerboro and bought a new one." Brooks went on to suggest they'd found a workable solution. Quote, "Football and basketball hadn't worked out well either, for about the same reasons, but water polo had been a success from the start. All the animals could swim, and they could all knock a ball in the direction they wanted it to go, with hoofs or paws or heads. At first, some of the smaller ones had been at a disadvantage until a rule had been made that cows and horses could use only their heads and not their hoofs in hitting the ball. After that, the two permanent teams, Byram's Red Pirates and Adoniram's Rural Commandos, had played a long series of games. Mr. Bean had even come up and umpired some of them. So the stage was set for Brooks to write a book called Freddy Plays Water Polo. It didn't happen. Nor did books featuring most other sports occasionally mentioned in the Freddy series. As it turns out, despite the Popinjay reference, some of the animals could play basketball, and did. You might think it might have been some of the taller ones, but no, it's the mice in Freddy Rides Again. Several books included wrestling, most notably Perilous Adventure, where Freddy took on Mr. Golcher. There were quick allusions to tennis and golf in several titles, and at one point we learned that Leo was a dashing duffer. Of course, horseback riding and even goatback riding played small parts in Freddy the Cowboy and Rides Again. Ice skating and skiing both appeared in North Pole and a few other titles. When I was a kid, it was hard to believe there was no such book as Freddy Plays Hockey, so I tried to write one, about which the less said, the better. Sometimes, of course, the ice melted, and that made possible a few accounts of swimming, diving, and canoeing, and water polo, which is much easier to play when the water is in liquid form. Our hero Freddy occasionally took to bicycle riding in hopes of getting into shape, but he wasn't very good at it. In Politician, he forgot how to use the brakes and instead pedaled faster and faster until he was roaring down a hill at 40 miles per hour. Just before crashing, he concluded that flying must feel about the same, and that therefore he never wanted to fly. Fortunately, Brooks reconsidered 13 years later in time for Freddy the Pilot. Later in the series, in Freddy Plays Football, and yes, we'll be looking at that book more in just a few minutes, there's a scene where our favorite pig did his best to delay a bike ride because he was scared. Brooks captured it perfectly. He picked up the bicycle, looking this time like an early Christian martyr out of whom the lions have already taken 2 or 3 bites. One sport our favorite pig seemed to take to with considerable enthusiasm was croquet, even though he was usually playing against prisoners at the local jail. The games always seemed to end with all involved enjoying bowls of ice cream, so they probably weren't really that helpful for staying in shape. Jinx, the aforementioned gym rat, kept a cupboard full of mechanical mice to wind up and chase, we learned in The Clockwork Twin. He often teased Freddy about needing to lose some weight. In Freddy and Mr. Camphor, he recommended, of all things, lawn mowing. "Best exercise in the world, and goodness knows you need it," Jinx said, poking Freddy in the ribs. In Freddy's Cousin Wheatley, Brooks himself suggested a non-traditional workout method. Yelling is about the hardest exercise there is, and if a lot of people who weigh too much would just yell 10 minutes a day instead of playing golf or tennis, they would reduce very quickly. Only, of course, the neighbors probably wouldn't like it very much. Brooks wisely chose not to produce a volume called Freddy Goes Yelling. We never saw Freddy Plays Croquet either. But in 1949, Brooks relented on the whole animals can't play most team sports thing and gave us Freddy Plays Football. It's worth noting that according to Michael Cart's excellent Brooks biography, Talking Animals and Other Stories, the man who created Freddy had played a bit of football himself at Mohegan Lake Academy, a small boys' school near Peekskill, New York. Walter played left end for the school's team and scored 2 touchdowns in a 1902 game. In Freddy Plays Football, the local team was struggling. The letters representing Centerboro High School, CHS, were said to mean "can't hope to score" and "creep, hobble, and stumble." The team didn't seem to stand a chance against perennial arch-rival Tushville. Our porcine hero offered a few ideas about how to change things. One was somewhat prescient. Quote, "Put a lot of lions and tigers into football suits and have them play." The other was simply not a good notion. Quote, "Shoot all the Tushville team." It probably doesn't help that flim-flam man Aaron Doty had been telling very iffy stories about having scored 3 touchdowns versus Notre Dame, including one where he carried the opposing team's left guard under one arm and the football under the other. In the same book, Doty also claimed to have been on the Olympic swim team, but he can't quite remember when. One day, Freddy watched the Centerboro team practice and idly tried on one of the helmets. The coach mistook him for a player and ordered him onto the field, where he turned out to be very good at getting underfoot and knocking people down. It became clear that having our pig on the team could make a big difference, but there was a not small problem. He wasn't a student at the school. But no worries. Freddy enlisted his nephew Wheatley to attend classes for him, on the theory that pigs pretty much look alike. It's an ethically challenged view at best, and perhaps even a bit pigist, if that's a word. Of course, some people just didn't like the idea of him playing football. Brooks told us that sports writers all over the county weighed in. Some were pro-pig and some were anti-pig. Some said, what of it? If a pig could be admitted to school and could keep up with the children in his studies, why should he be debarred from free participation in athletics? Others said, what is the country coming to when our school games are degenerating into brutal contests with wild animals like the ancient Romans? But the National Committee, which makes the football rules, decided to wait and see. It will be time to make a ruling, the chairman said in an interview in the Times, when elephants and tigers are introduced into the game. Then, of course, we shall have to take steps. In the big game against Tushville, Centerboro faked them out by having Freddy start slow, but eventually he showed the opponents what he was capable of and even scored a touchdown by tucking the ball, which he couldn't carry under his trotters, into his helmet strap. He got away with the ringer ruse, but he wasn't the only player who should have been on the field. Tushville's team included 3 players well beyond high school age, known as Butcher, Blackbeard, and Canner. They all made it a point to play dirty against Freddy, hitting him and pulling his tail. Freddy defended himself by biting Blackbeard on the leg, the sort of thing that would clearly earn a penalty if a referee was watching. But the refs were tired of the Tushvillian shenanigans, so when Blackbeard complained, an official said, "Yeah, why didn't you bite him back?" In a follow-up game, Tushville fielded a team that included only 4 actual students, plus, among others, Blackbeard, Butcher, and 2 horses. Centerboro responded with a lineup including Mac the Wildcat, Freddy, Mrs. Wiggins, Hank the Horse, Mrs. Wurzburger, Bill the Goat, and a student or 3. Final score, Centerboro 184, Tushville 17. Lessons learned? Well, let's not look too closely, eh? Before we move on, there's a random bit from football that's too good not to share here. Freddy's talking about motivating runners, and he comes up with this gem. If you want to get race records broken, instead of firing a pistol at the starting line, you ought to ring a dinner bell at the finish. Of course, the other Freddy book featuring a team sport was Freddy and the Baseball Team from Mars, published in 1955. Again, it was a story involving ringers, and this time with a side bet thrown in for bad measure. The animals and some three-eyed friends from outer space put together a credible team when Boomschmidt's circus happened to spend the winter in Centerboro. I suppose it's possible that the fat paychecks from TV rights to beam the games back to Mars were an incentive. The tale began more or less with the Martians playing catch and hearing about baseball from Hercules, the Boomschmidt circus strongman. Herc pitched in the major leagues one year but quit because he said it wasn't challenging enough. If the balls were cannonballs and the bats were made of iron, that might be more worthwhile, he said. Unfortunately, he did a miserable job explaining the game to the Martians and left them believing that the purpose was for the pitcher to hit the batter and knock him cold. If he did so, he scored 1. If the batter could dodge and hit the ball and knock the cover off it, that scored 1 for his side. The Martians weren't really impressed until Freddy came along and told them how the game really worked. Before long, Freddy suggested to Mr. Boomschmidt that having a pitcher with 4 throwing arms could provide a significant competitive advantage. Mr. B put together a team including himself, Oscar the Ostrich, Leo the Lion, 2 elephants, and several Martians. Needless to say, getting uniforms to fit such a varied bunch would be very expensive, and that eventually led to the side bet in hopes of coming up with the money. Freddy served as the team's manager, but he was having a little problem with Mr. Eha, so he was in one of his incognito phases. As we know, pig disguises always work. This time he was Mr. Arquebus, a crusty old codger who apparently took up lodging at the equivalent of an Airbnb in Freddy's pig pen, and the team practiced in a field on the Bean farm, through the winter, because Mr. Arquebus insisted that would make them tougher. Getting a very early start on spring training was just one of Freddy's strategies. Another was to let the Martians swing on every pitch, which they wanted to do anyway, even though they rarely connected with the ball. The trick worked beautifully as a fake-out when the Boomschmidt team lost to the Centerboro team, convincing observers from Tushville that the Martians were easy strikeouts. When the big game arrived, Freddy changed things up and told the Martians not to swing. He knew that because they were so short, their strike zones were tiny, so the Tushville pitcher would probably walk most of the Martians. A clever ruse. Anyone who's ever been obsessed with baseball knows where Walter Brooks got that idea. It came from a real major league stunt 4 years earlier. On August 19, 1951, the St. Louis Browns sent Eddie Geidel, all 3 feet 7 inches of him, to the plate as a pinch hitter against the Detroit Tigers. Geidel, in his first and only at-bat, did indeed walk on 4 pitches. For what it's worth, the Browns still lost the game, but owner Bill Veeck Jr. got the free advertising that was what he really wanted. The trick was just as effective against the Tushville team, whose coach, a Mr. Kurtz, complained loudly. Freddy defended the Martians keeping the bats on their shoulders, noting they're not obliged to try to get hits off you. Kurtz angrily said, "Ain't any pitcher can pitch strikes to a bunch of little spiders." Freddy, or Coach Arquebus, responded by pointing out that Tushville was fielding at least 3 ringers, and that Tushville went into the game knowing full well the Martians were small, but figured that didn't matter because they swung at everything. There were a few moments when things didn't go quite according to plan. At one point, Chirp Squeak, whose 4 arms and 7 fingers on each hand made him a formidable pitcher, really wanted to swing the bat and reacted to Freddy's orders by calling his coach a big ape. Boomschmidt observed with pride that the Martians were quickly learning the language. "Yeah," said Freddy, "they sure are learning a fine American disrespect for anyone in authority." Other Martians rebelled in similar ways and generally played poorly because their colleague, Squeak Squeak, had been, plot twist alert, kidnapped, and they feared for his safety if they won the game. But Freddy and Boomschmidt saved Squeak Squeak, you'll have to read the book to find out how, and brought him back to the ballpark, which gave the Martians the incentive they needed. While Boomschmidt stepped out for the rescue mission, an alligator stepped in for him playing third base. When Mr. B returned, he was too tired to play, and suggested that Freddy, who no longer needed to pretend he was Mr. Arquebus, should go into the game and play third. Sure enough, our pig, after wisely lowering expectations by stating, "I've never played baseball before in my life," pulled on a glove and took the field. When his turn at bat came around, he wasn't able to see the first few pitches because Mr. Eha was sitting in the stands with a mirror and shining it toward the batter's box. Hercules came to the rescue, throwing a ball that knocked down Mr. Eha and, no doubt in his mind, scored one for the good guys. Freddy followed up by hitting a triple, more or less accidentally, part of a rally that won the game for the Boomschmidt 9. Under the terms of the side bet between Boomschmidt and Kurtz, the winning team got all the gate receipts, enough money to buy uniforms fit for elephants and aliens with extra appendages. So what have we learned? 3 things, I think. Number 1, animals can't play team sports. Number 2, animals can play team sports. Number 3, always bet on Freddy's team.